Hello, my name is Mete Atamel. I'm a developer advocate at Google, and today I want to go through a Codelab with you. The name of the Codelab is Build Event-Driven Orchestration with Eventarc and Workflows. Now, as you can see, there's two key phrases in the title, event-driven and orchestration. So let's zoom into those a little bit before we dive into the Codelab. When you have multiple services, at some point, these services need to communicate, and you need to decide how they will communicate. One easy way is services to call each other directly. So you can have service A call service B can call service C, and so on and so forth. This is easy to implement, but it creates unnecessary coupling between services. So if you need to change service B, you need to know that service A is calling it, and you need to know that it calls service C. So you need to think about those dependencies. Now, to make it more loosely coupled, what you can do is you can use an event-driven approach. In an event-driven architecture, services, they do their work, and when they are finished, they just emit an event. That event goes to a message broker, and the message broker figures out which other services care about this message, and it passes it on. And then the next service does its work, and it will just emit another message. In this event-driven model, services don't know about each other, and they don't care about each other. Instead, they just consume messages and they emit messages. This allows more loosely coupled kind of architecture, and it makes it easier to change services without having to think about the next services in the chain. At the same time, it also makes it hard to trace your architecture. So if something goes wrong, for example, if an event cannot be processed, or if a service goes down, it will be difficult to figure out exactly where things are not working. Now, a third approach is called orchestration. In orchestration, you have an external service, an orchestrator, where you define how the services should be called, in what order. And the orchestrator is responsible for making sure that the services are called, and result is being taken, and that result is passed to the next service. Now, in orchestration, you basically bring some order to your service-to-service communication, and it makes it easier to trace if something goes wrong. Now, in this Codelab, we are combining both approaches. We are combining event-driven, and we're also combining orchestration with it. And the reason for that is that in some use cases, you want the structure provided by orchestration. So you want certain services to be orchestrated because you want to make sure they're called in a certain order. But at the same time, you don't want your whole architecture to be an orchestration. Instead, you can have the orchestration be triggered by an event in a loosely coupled way, or you can also have the orchestration send an event at the end of the orchestration. This allows the best of both worlds, where you have some things orchestrated, but the other orchestrations are communicating in a loosely coupled way. So that's what we're going to build today in this Codelab. And let's just go and get started with the Codelab. Okay, so I have the Codelab on the left, and I also have the Google Cloud Console on the right. But let's look at the Codelab first. You should have the link in the description. And what we're going to do is, as I mentioned, we're going to build an event-driven orchestration with Eventarc and Workflows. Eventarc, it's a service from Google Cloud that allows you to connect different services. So you can connect different event sources to different event destinations. And Eventarc makes it really easy by just basically creating a trigger. So we're going to use that for the event-driven part of the Codelab. Now, for orchestration, we're going to be using Workflows, which is an orchestration service for Google Cloud. And Workflows allows you to orchestrate pretty much any kind of HTTP, a public HTTP endpoint. So this can be on HTTP on Cloud Run or Cloud Functions, or anywhere, actually, not even on Google Cloud. It can be outside of Google Cloud. Workflows can bring that into an orchestration. And that's what we're going to use as well. And then for our code, we're going to be using Cloud Functions. So we're going to be deploying 4 Cloud Functions that do different things. And in the end, we'll build an app where we'll orchestrate these functions using Workflows, but we'll connect that orchestration to Google Cloud Storage events using Eventarc. And I'm going to talk about more about the application in the next steps. But as an overall architecture, this is what we have. Some cloud functions that are orchestrated, and they get triggered by an event from cloud storage. Now, before we start, we have some setup and requirements. So let's go through them in step 2. So first, you need a Google Cloud project, okay? And you also need a billing account. So if you have a Google Cloud project and if you have billing attached to that project, great, you can just use that if you like. But we also have this, we're also giving you some credits. So if you go to this link, gcpcredits.com/io 2022, let's click on that. This takes you to a page where you need to log in with a Gmail account. And then once you do that, you can click here to access your credits. And you'll see your first name and last name, and then there's a coupon code. And then if you accept and continue, what this does is that it creates a billing account with some credits for you, okay? I won't do this because I already have my setup, but once you do this, you will have a billing account with some credits, and then later you can attach that billing account to your existing projects, or you can also create a new project and use that billing account. And I'll actually show you this on my Google Cloud Console. So let's switch here. You see that I have a project, but if I go to my billing, I will manage my billing accounts, and you'll see that I have 2 billing accounts. The first one is Google Cloud Platform Trial Billing Account. So this is the billing account that will be created for you after you go through this process. I also have another billing account for my own projects. So you can pick and choose whatever you want, but this credit is basically for you to be able to do the Codelab if you don't have billing set up. But if you already have billing set up, you can also use that as well, okay? So that's that. So once you have the billing set up, next step is to actually either select a project or use a project or create a project. So it's up to you. If you have an existing project, you can use that. But you also, if you want something fresh, you can start from a new project. So here, let me just create a project just to show you how this works. So here I am, as you can see, in Google Cloud Console, and I have multiple projects already set up. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to click on New Project here. And let's give this a name, event. Let's call this Event-Driven Orchestration. And then for the billing account, if you redeemed what we told you earlier, then you will have this. Or if you have an existing billing account, you can use that as well. I'll just choose my existing billing account. And I don't need to choose organization, so I'll just hit create. And now a new project is being created for us, okay? So you can do this as well, or if you have an existing project, you can just select it from here and make sure that you are in a project. So we have that, and we'll make a note of the project ID because we'll use that throughout the Codelab. So the project ID, you can see it from here. So when you have your projects, the ID is listed here, and you can see it from there. All right, so that's our project and billing setup. Now, next, we're going to be using Cloud Shell to do the Codelab. So to interface with Google Cloud, you have a couple of options. You can either download Google Cloud SDK, and that gives you a G-Cloud command line tool. And with that tool, you can basically use your laptop and use G-Cloud to interface with Google Cloud if you like. And you can certainly do that if you like. But you can also use Cloud Shell, which is a terminal within the browser. It gives you a terminal within the browser. It's easier because we are already in Google Cloud Console, and we can have a terminal here and we can do everything here. So that's what I'm going to use. But before we get there, let me make sure that our project is created. So here, the event-driven orchestration is here. So I'll just select the project. It's not finished loading yet. So let me refresh. And let me switch to my other account. So yeah, you need to make sure that you're in your right account if you are using multiple accounts like me. And you also want to make sure that the project that you created shows up in the list. It's not showing up yet, so let me refresh one more time. and select all. I think the project is created, but yeah, let's go here and select project. Okay, now I'm in the right project. So that's why it's important to make sure that you are in the right project. So you can see that I'm in event-driven orchestration project, and it's just recently created. Now that I'm here, you want to go to Cloud Shell. So the Cloud Shell is right here. So you click on Activate Cloud Shell, and now this gives you basically a virtual machine in the cloud. Now it's being initialized, and once it's initialized, you will be able to run commands within the browser right here. So we'll wait for that. And by the way, you will have some space on your Cloud Shell to get some code or save some files. It's really a full development environment with an editor and things like that. So you can do everything from the browser. It's very useful for Codelabs and also for just quick editing of your projects. So depending on the time of the day, sometimes it takes a little bit of time to Cloud Shell to allocate you a virtual machine. But as you can see, we already have it here, which is great. Now I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. Now we need to set up some things. We're going to be needing project ID throughout the Codelab. So let's make sure that we set the project ID to our actual project ID. And in this case, my project ID is, actually my project ID is a little bit different than the name. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And it's important to note that the name and the ID of the project is not the same as always. So sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's not the same. So here you need to make sure that you're using the ID of the project. So I'll do that. And then the next thing is the region. So we're going to be deploying services to different regions, and you can choose any region that Cloud Function is supported. So if you look at this page, there's many locations where Cloud Functions is supported. In this case, I'm just going to use US Central 1, but you can pick and choose whatever you like. And we will also set these on gcloud. So I'll just copy and paste this. Gcloud config set core project and also gcloud config set. We need to authorize for the first time functions and region. So this will set this project ID and region in gcloud. And if I actually do gcloud config list, you should see that our function region is set and our project ID is also set. This makes it easier when we run commands later, okay? So that's that. And then we also need to enable some services. So let me clear this. And let me just copy and paste this, and I'll explain what they are. So let's copy and paste. Because in Google Cloud, by default, the services are not enabled. So we need to enable them. We're going to need artifact registry and cloud build because we're going to be building functions, and for functions, you need these. Then we need to enable the functions API. So that's what we do here. We need to enable Eventarc for eventing. We need to enable Vision API that we're going to use in our code. And then finally, we need to enable a couple of workflows APIs so that we can do orchestration, right? So these are the things that we need, and we enable them. So you should see this operation successful at the end. So yeah, so this is all the setup that we need to do. The next thing is to get the source code. So the functions, we don't have time to write them from scratch. Instead, the code is already on GitHub. And we're just gonna sync to that GitHub and just take a look at it. So we'll do that. So let me make sure I actually already have this. So I'm gonna delete that. And we're gonna, so there's this Eventarc samples repo. Let me just actually open that and show it to you. This is on GitHub, where we have a number of samples for Eventarc and workflows and things. But the one that we are interested in is under processing pipelines folder. And under here, you will see that there's image v1, image v2, image v3. These are different versions of the app. We're going to be actually deploying the version 3, the latest version of this app. But this is where the code will live, and we'll look at it as we go along, okay? So what I will do is I will go back to, let's close these. I will go back to here, and then we'll just clone the source code. So we'll clone the Eventarc samples repo, and then we'll go to Eventarc samples and a processing pipelines folder, right? So that's where we are, and we see the different image processing pipelines. Okay, so this is setup and requirements. So we have we set up our G-Cloud, we set our environment variables, we got the code. Now, before proceeding further, let's actually talk about what we're gonna build so that you have an idea on what kind of application we are building. Okay, so that's step 3. Let's make this smaller. So what we are building here, it's an image processing pipeline. The idea is that users save an image to a cloud storage bucket, and then we have a number of services that will act on that image. It will take that image, it will resize that image, it will label that image, and it will watermark that image, and they will save them to this output bucket, right? So an image comes in, and then it gets transformed in multiple ways, and then the image will be saved to the output folder. So that's the application image processing pipeline. And the way it flows is that first user saves the image to a storage bucket. That will trigger an event, a new object creation event. And that event will be picked up by Eventarc cloud storage trigger. So that event will be picked up and it will be passed to a workflow, okay? This workflow, it's an image processing workflow. Also, okay, you can think of it as an orchestration. And it will get that event, and then it will call some cloud functions in certain order. So it will call a filter function first, then it will call the labeler function, and the labeler function will label the image and save it to the output bucket. Then it will call the resizer bucket to resize the image and save it to the output bucket. And then it will also call the watermarker to watermark the image and save it to the output bucket, right? And why is this event-driven orchestration? Because we have these functions that need to be called in a certain order with certain parameters, and we put those in an orchestration with workflows. So this is an orchestration that we'll go through later. But at the same time, it's event-driven because the event from cloud storage through Eventarc is starting this orchestration. So it's loosely coupled in that sense, that an event triggers it in a loosely coupled way, but this user doesn't know that there's an orchestration. And then the orchestrator doesn't know really, it just gets an event through workflows. So that's the event-driven orchestration part of it. Yeah, so this is what we're gonna build. And the way we're gonna build this is that first we're gonna deploy the functions. So we will deploy filter, labeler, resizer, and watermarker. And then we're gonna put them together into an orchestration with workflows. So that will kind of tie them together into an orchestration. And then finally, we'll connect that orchestration to the cloud storage events using Eventarc trigger, okay? So we'll kind of build it backwards from this side to the left side. All right, and as you see, we have the input bucket and the output bucket. So the next step, in step 4, is actually creating these buckets. So let's do that actually. Let's create these buckets before we do anything else. So I'll just switch back to our Cloud Shell. Let's do a clear. And I will just copy and paste this code. So the bucket names in Google Cloud have to be unique. So what I'm doing is that I'm taking the project ID, which is unique, and adding -images input for the input bucket and -images output for the output bucket. And I'm using GSUtil to create it from console. You can also do it from here if you like. But if you look at cloud storage, under here, now that we run this, we see 2 buckets, input and output bucket, right? So they are created. So these will be kind of the inputs and outputs to our architecture. Now next, we want to deploy the filter service. So before we do that, let's go back to architecture overview. So we created the buckets. Now let's deploy the filter service, the first service that we want to deploy. And before I show you the code, let me actually run this code, run this deployment script. So let's run this. And as it's deploying, I want to explain you what this function does. So let me clear this and let's paste it. And okay, and as this is happening, let's look at the filter function. So the filter function, the code is on GitHub. It's a C# function, so it's written in C#, but it can be any language that Cloud Functions support, like Node.js or Python or anything else. But the function itself, it's an HTTP function, so it receives HTTP calls. And the first thing that you're going to realize is that the function is extracting the bucket and the file information from the event. So it will receive an event from Workflows, and that event will have the bucket and file information, the actual file basically that triggered this event. So it's extracting that. Then it's calling a method called isPictureSafe with the URL of the file. And if you look at the isPictureSafe method, it's using a Vision client. So this is a Vision API client on Google Cloud. And it's calling detect safe search async. So it's basically making a call to Vision API and saying, is this image with this URL safe or not? And this returns some likelihoods. So what we are looking at is basically we are checking if the response is adult medical spoof violence and if it's likely or not. So if it's not likely at all, we conclude that the picture is safe, so we return true. Otherwise, we conclude that the picture might not be safe, so we return false, okay? So once we have this safety flag, the reply data, so what we reply back from this function is simple Boolean. We just say safe equals true or false, right? So that's all this function does. It receives the file event, and then it checks whether it's safe, and it returns a response that says this picture is safe or not. Like, quite simple, okay? So, and the way we deploy this is, we use gcloud functions deploy. So we are deploying this as a cloud function. We're making it a public function, although it doesn't have to be public. You should probably have private functions from Workflows. Runtime is .NET 3 because this is a .NET C# kind of function. It's HTTP triggered. Region is US Central. We deploy to US Central, and this is the entry point of our function. And we also pass in a build environment variables because our function has some dependencies outside the immediate folder. That's why I'm calling it from this top level folder, processing pipelines. And since I'm calling it from a top level folder with common libraries, I need to pass in this environment variable to tell cloud functions where the actual code is, right? That's what it is trying to do. So you can see that it's deployed and it has a URL, this function. So we're gonna need that URL. So that's why I have this filter URL environment variable that I'm gonna set because we're gonna need it later. So let's just get that. And if I do echo filter URL, you can see that I have the filter the URL of the filter function basically. Okay, so this is the first function deployed. Next, we're gonna deploy labeler. So that's step 6. So let's go to step 6. Again, it's the same kind of deployment. So I'm gonna kick off the deployment before I show you the code. So let's make sure that starts. And let's take a look at the labeler function. Now the labeler function, it's exactly the same as before. It's a C# function that has, it's an HTTP function as well. But what it's gonna do is slightly different. So it still receives the event, the file event. But this time it will call an extract label method. And in this extract label, we use Vision API again. So this is a Vision client, and we call detect labels async. This extract the labels out of the image using machine learning, okay? So it will get the labels of the image, and we are getting 10 results because we don't need more than 10. And then we order them with their score, and we return the ordered labels. So we have the labels here. And then what we do afterwards is first, we save these labels to a text file with the name of the file -labels.txt, and we save all of them to a text file. So all 10 labels, we save them to a text file, and we upload them to Google Cloud Storage. And then we also extract the top 3 labels, and we return them as the reply data from the function. So the function will return these top 3 labels as the output basically. So you can see that we're storing the full labels in a text file in case you want to take a look, but we are returning the top 3 labels as a reply data. And that will be used by orchestration later that I'm going to show you how it's used. So that's the next service, the labeler service. And we're going to need the URL of this service as well, because we're going to use it from the orchestration. So we'll save that as well once this function is deployed. So I'm just going to copy this. And once this is deployed, we'll get that as well. So let me actually go here and go to Cloud Functions just to see that functions are being deployed. So you can see that the filter and labeler functions are already deployed. And let's make sure that we get the labeler URL that we're going to need later. And if I do echo labeler URL, you see that the labeler URL is there. So that's good. All right, so back to architecture, we deployed filter, we deployed labeler, and next one is Resizer. So let's deploy the Resizer service. Again, the same kind of deal. Let's copy the Resizer and kick the deployment before I explain to you what it does. And with Resizer, as the name suggests, let's look at the code. It resizes images. So the function, again, an HTTP function that receives the bucket and the file just like before. But this time it downloads the image from the cloud storage. Then it uses a library to resize that image to width and the height that we specify. And in this case, the width and the height is 400 to 400. So we resize it in this code. Then we save the file as the name of the file, -400 and 400.png. Then we upload the image back to cloud storage. And then we reply back with the bucket and the file of the resized image, okay? So we upload the image and we also say, okay, this is the image that I resized and this is the bucket and the file of the resized image. And again, we're going to use this reply data from orchestration. So you can see that in these functions, it's very simple. Like they receive an event and they do one thing at a time. And that's the beauty of functions. You don't need to do many things. Actually, you shouldn't do many things. You just do one thing at a time. And once you're done, you just reply back with your reply. And that's it. There's not much complicated logic in functions. And you don't want complicated logics, because if you put a lot of stuff in a function, it will be hard to maintain because you need to do everything in a single function, basically. All right, so that's the Resizer. And once it's deployed, which happened, we'll also get the Resizer URL, and we're gonna need that again later. All right, so that's the Resizer, and let's go back to architecture overview. The last one is Watermarker, the function. That's the last one that we're gonna deploy. So we go to step 8. And again, I will copy this to start the process of deploying Watermarker. All right, so as this is happening, let's look at the code with Watermarker. And Watermarker is probably the most interesting function out of all, because it kind of combines all the information from the previous steps. So what happens in Watermarker is that this time, Watermarker receives more information than just the bucket and the file. The Watermarker will receive the bucket and the file of the resized image, but it will also receive the labels of the image from the previous function, right? So it receives those. It downloads the resized image from cloud storage. Then it uses a library to apply a watermark, basically a text on the file, with the labels that it received. So you can see here, we're applying a simple watermark, and we are passing in the labels that we received from the previous function. So we apply that watermark, save it as JPEG, and then we save the file name -watermark JPEG, and then we upload that file back to cloud storage. Okay. So combining basically everything that we see in the resized image and the labels into a new image, and we upload that back to cloud storage. And you can look at the code if you like in terms of how we do this watermarking if you want. All right, so once this is done, we'll also have a Watermarker URL that we're gonna need. So I'm gonna save that as well. And then we'll be done with functions. I mean, functions will be deployed, but they don't know about each other. They don't call each other. They just exist on their own. So we need to kind of bring them together into some kind of an orchestration. And for that, we're going to use workflow. But I will wait for Watermarker to be deployed first so we can proceed with the next step. And also you want to make sure that once all your services are deployed, just make sure that they show up here. Let's go home and come back later once everything is deployed. And usually the functions, they take a couple of minutes to deploy, but sometimes it might take a little bit longer. So we'll just wait a few seconds before we check. All right, so that's deployed as well. And before I forget, let me get the Watermarker URL. So we got that. And if I go to Cloud Functions, I see that there's 4 functions: filter, labeler, resizer, Watermarker. They're all deployed. They're all running. So everything is good. Now we can go to our architecture overview. Now we need to bring them together into an orchestration so that they are called in the order that we defined, and the arguments are passed along and things like that. So that's step 9. And to define workflow, we're going to use Google Cloud Workflows service. And you need to define that in YAML or JSON. So we have this workflow.yaml file. If you go back to our Cloud Shell, you will see that under image with v3, we have this workflow.yaml where the workflow is defined, okay? So let's take a look at that actually in a little bit more detail, because that's the kind of the meat of the Codelab, how to bring these services together with workflow. So if you look at this workflow.yaml, you will see that now in this workflow, we are defining how services should be called, right? But first thing that we need to do is that, who's going to trigger this workflow? You can either execute it yourself, but in our case, we're going to have events from Eventarc executing it, right? So that's why we have this first parameter event indicating that this workflow is going to receive an event. It's actually a cloud event from Eventarc, right? And then after that, we define steps. What should happen in this orchestration? The first step is called log event. So we just log the event that we received just to see what we have is useful for debugging. And then next step, we were extracting the information that we need from event. So we are extracting the bucket and the name from the event. So this event is going to be a file storage event from cloud storage with the bucket and the name. So we'll just extracting that and assigning them to these variables, bucket and file variable, okay? Then the next step is filter. So in this step, we are making an HTTP post call to filter URL. Now this filter URL, it's a placeholder right now. We need to replace that with the actual filter URL that we saved from our cloud function. So that's why I say I have this to-do replace here, and we'll do that in the next step. But we'll make a call to that filter URL, and in the body of this HTTP post, we'll pass in the bucket and the file that we received from the event, right? So we are basically saying to the filter, just filter this file in this bucket for us. The filter will have a response, and we'll capture that response in filter response. So that's what this is about. Then now the next step is to log the safety. So the filter response will have the body, and the body will have a safe JSON that will say safe, true, or false. So we're just logging that just so that we can see. And then after we log it, we need to actually check it. So this check safety actually checks the response from and the body and the safe and see if it's true. If it's true, then it will continue with label step. So the label step is the next step, right? It will just continue there. But if it's false, meaning the picture is not safe, then the next step is end, meaning this orchestration will end, right? So we check the safety. If it's not safe, we just finish there. We don't do anything else. And then the next step after this is that now that we know the image is safe, we call the labeler function. Again, the labeler URL is the placeholder that we'll replace. And we pass in the bucket and the file information. And then we save the response of this labeler function in labeler response. Then we call the resizer, again with the resizer URL and with bucket and file, and we save the response in resizer response, right? So very similar. And finally, we call the watermark function. Now with the watermark function, we pass in more information. We pass in the bucket, the file, or the resize image. So you can see that we are getting that from the resize response. So we are getting it from this resize call. So that's the resize image bucket and file. And we also get the labels from the label response, so from the label function. So the response that we get from resize and the response that we get from label, we pass that to our watermark function, and the watermark will do its work and it will return a response as well. Okay. And then finally, we have a final step. In this step, we are just returning a JSON of filter, label, resize, and watermark, where we just return this HTTP status code from each service. Okay, just to see that if they work. I mean, you could return anything else you want. You could return the URL of the image if you like, or something else. But here I'm just returning the HTTP code from each service. So you see how nicely we can define what should happen in what order and what happens with the response and how you pass the response from one step to another step, things like that. That's what workflow is good for. All right, so we are in step 9. We check the workflow, and here I'm explaining what each do, but I already did that to you. But what we need to do is we need to deploy this workflow. So we are in image-v3 folder, I believe. Yes, we are. So to deploy it, well, before we deploy it, we need to change this URLs, these placeholders with actual URLs. And remember, we saved these URLs as we went along, right? So we had echo, for example, if I do echo filter URL, you see that I have the actual URL. So we need to change them. You can manually change them in workflow.yaml if you like, but you can also use sed. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to use sed. And if I do git diff, actually, you can see that our workflow changed, and the placeholders are changed with the actual URLs of the functions, which is what I want. And then once we do that, to deploy the workflow, we just say gcloud workflows deploy, give it a name, in this case, image processing, and then we point to our source and we point to our region, right? So this is it. This is how you deploy a workflow, and it's quite quick, actually. Within a few seconds, it should be deployed. But this deploys the workflow, but it doesn't actually run it. Now, if we go to workflows, we should see that there is this image processing workflow, but there's no execution of it. Nothing triggered this yet because we didn't set that up yet. But if we go to source, let's make this a little bit bigger. If you go to source, you can see our definition, but also you can see this visualization where it shows you, in this workflow, we log the event, we filter it, we check for safety. If it's not safe, we finish. But if it's safe, we continue, right? So it's very useful to kind of visualize what's happening in workflow. All right, so our orchestration, let's go back to architecture overview again. So we are basically here where we deploy the services, we put them together into an orchestration. And the last step is to actually connect this orchestration to an event from cloud storage. And we'll do that using Eventarc cloud storage trigger. So the Eventarc will be used to make the connection. So that's step 10. Now in Eventarc, there's one-time setup. So you need to, first of all, you need to have a service account that has a Eventarc.event receiver role. And you'll use this service account when you create a trigger. You need to have the service account. You have two choices. You can actually create a service account and give it to this Eventarc event receiver role, or you can use the default compute service account that comes with every project and just make sure that it has this role. So in this case, I'm just using the default compute service account. So first, let's get the project number because you need that for the service account name. So let me make this bigger. Let's clear this. So let's get the project number. And then here we are adding a policy binding. And we are just saying that, this service account with this project number -compute, this is the default compute service account, will have the role event receiver. So we are making sure that it has this role. And since we are using cloud storage trigger here, we also need to make sure that the cloud storage service account, there's also a default service account for that, has an PubSub publisher role for it as well, okay? And so I'll just, again, copy and paste this. This is this default service account for cloud storage. And then let's make sure that we have a policy binding for that. And it has PubSub publisher role. Now, this is a one-time setup. So once you did this once in your project, you don't have to do it again. But since we are using a new project, I want to make sure that we have this set up. Okay, now that we have that, how do we connect cloud storage events to workflows? Well, we do that through what's called an Eventarc trigger. So let me copy and paste this, and then I will explain what this does. So this creates a trigger, and let's look at the details basically. So we are saying that I want to create a trigger with this name, which is going to be trigger dash my workflow name, image processing. By the way, it's failed. So sometimes if this fails, let me run this one more time, see what happens. Okay, so now it's creating the trigger. So we are saying that we want to create a trigger in this region, which is US Central. And I want these events to go to a workflow with this name, image processing. And this workflow lives in this location, US Central, because everything is localized in Google Cloud. So that's why we need to specify the region. And then we also have some event filters. So we don't want all the events to go to workflow. We only want events from this bucket, which is the input bucket, to our workflow input bucket that we are interested in. And then we also don't want all the events from this bucket. We only want object finalized events. So this is the object finalized event, which gets triggered when you save a new object. So if someone saves a new object, we want that to trigger, but otherwise we don't care about other events. And we also pass in a service account. So this created the trigger after the second try. I don't know what happened in the first one, but if we go to Eventarc, we should see a trigger, trigger image processing, and destination is a workflow, and it's actually targeting image processing workflow. Okay, so everything seems to be working. Well, not working, but at least set up. So let's, in step 11, let's just test out whether this works. And to test it out, all we need to do is upload a picture and see that it's processed. So what we're gonna do is we can use GSUtil to upload an image, but let's do it from the UI. So I go to cloud storage, and I see my input and output buckets. So let's go to input bucket. You see there's no images here. I will upload a picture of myself. And now, as this is uploading, let's actually go to workflows and see what happens. So if you go to workflows, click on the workflow image processing, you see that there's an execution now that's active, right? So the uploading of the image triggered an event through Eventarc, and that event is now in workflows, and the workflows is now working through that event. And if we click in the execution, and it's already succeeded, by the way, so it's pretty quick. But if we look at the inputs and the outputs of the execution, you see that this is the input that it received. So this is the event that it received from Google Cloud Storage with the bucket and data and the information about the image. And this is the output that workflows did. So the output is what we kind of produced: filter service, label service, resize service, and Watermarker service. They're all returning 200, HTTP 200, meaning they all work fine. So it seems like things are working. And if you look at the logs, we see that the event is being logged, and also the safety, whether the image is safe or not, is logged. And if we let's do one more image just for the fun of it. Let's upload a beach, a more interesting picture with sunshine and things. So let's upload that, and this will trigger as well. And then just to check that things are working, if we go to this output bucket, you see that we have 3 different files. So first, Atamel. So this was my image. So we have a labels.txt, And if we look at this labels.txt, these are all the labels that was picked up by Vision API. So it says forehead, cheek, smile. So that sounds like me. Then if you look at 400 to 400 PNG, that's the resize image. So you see that it's squeezed a little bit. Maybe not the right way of resizing, but it's definitely resize. And then if you look at the 400 to 400 watermark, you see that it's the resize image with the top 3 labels added as a watermark. So it seems like everything is working. And then the other picture, the beach one, is more interesting. You see that it says water, cloud, sky, again, the same kind of thing from there. So this concludes our Codelab. You've seen how to combine an event-driven and an orchestrated architecture into one. Hopefully this was useful to you. Feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions or feedback. Thanks very much.